Hello, I'm Tom Parker and welcome to Voices from the CEPS Ideas Lab. In this episode, I spoke to Dr. Tinatin Akhvlediani. Tina is a research fellow in the EU Foreign Policy Unit at CEPS, specialising in the EU's enlargement, trade policies, the Eastern Neighbourhood and Ukraine. During our interview, we discussed how to make enlargement policies credible and the security guarantees Europe can offer Ukraine. Since we recorded this, President Trump cut military aid to Ukraine, provoking European powers to rethink their security measures in support of President Zelensky. Then, on March 11th, as Ukrainian and American delegates met in Saudi Arabia, the White House resumed military support and intelligence sharing with Kyiv, while simultaneously pushing for a 30-day ceasefire deal. In light of peace talks in Europe and the Middle East, Tina's predictions in this episode offer a brilliant perspective of what the next few months have in store for the EU, Ukraine, and global geopolitics. I hope you enjoy the episode. Well, welcome, Tina. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, look, it's a crucial topic of discussion at the moment, which is EU enlargement, especially given geopolitical climate. And I want to ask, how do you make EU enlargement policies credible?
That's, I think, a very good question to ask today, because EU's enlargement policy has been quite dormant for the past 2 decades. The Western Balkan countries have gotten their European perspective back in 2003 at Thessaloniki summit, but since then, no Western Balkan country has joined the European Union. That was Croatia that we've seen acceding to the EU, but only one country back in 2013. And then, the enlargement policy has been dormant, and to the previous commissions, we've even seen Jean-Claude Juncker saying, EU was not ready for the enlargement, it would not enlarge. So the question today is just saying and paying all this attention to enlargement, is it enough to make it credible, right? I think it's very, very good that momentum is there. The commission of Ursula von der Leyen, the first term, as well as the second term, and commissioners are quite outspoken that enlargement is basically, taking its effect and its incentives, and it's re-energized. And we've seen a lot of movements, but this enlargement is very much driven by the security concerns. The security concerns come from the war that is still raging at the European continent. We are speaking here about 3 years of full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Yeah. That has been, incentivizing factor. And Western Balkans also follow with this flow, so the whole process is very much energized. What we also witness is very fast progress of particularly Ukraine and Moldova, a fast forward to the European integration, which is a big success. But still the question is, will this be enough to retain the speed, and what is it missing, if anything, to make this enlargement really credible? And to me, this is really security. The question here is to ask is, can EU defend itself, and can it defend its candidate countries standing in a line? And to me, that would really make the EU's enlargement credible if the EU had this strategy, how it can provide security guarantees and how it can defend itself as it is today and as it aims to be, by 2030 or maybe earlier or maybe later, we don't know.
Well, then how does the EU become sort of capable of defending itself, especially if there needs to fill the gap with recent movements from the Trump's White House? How does it fill that gap?
I mean, there is a big gap there, but before starting filling the gap, I think it's also the EU's identity. It has to really become security at the EU level concern and the policy, which really requires 27 countries to stand together. Currently, This is really not the case. So starting point is really getting united at one point, that security is something that is too important, to set aside. I mean, the EU member states should really stand together. So the unity, change of the mindset, and really big dedication, because security and defense policy cannot be built overnight, over weeks or 2 weeks. This really requires a lot of money, a lot of spending on it, a clear strategy, but long-term strategy, because this cannot be done overnight. What we are currently seeing as the Trump shifts the foreign policy of the United States is really that Europe and the EU is not alone. We see in the game Canada, we see in the game, Norway, wider Europe, who also, and UK, of course, which is now hosting the summit. This only tells us that, this is really wider European concern, and that also requires pulling all the resources together so that Europe can actually be stronger. And these are the countries who we see in the game currently that actually have the hard power, unlike the European Union. I mean, EU member states, they have their hard powers, but the Union as itself does not really have, right, the hard power. It can defend itself.
Sure.
So bringing these countries into the game, having them, all of them together at the same table, I think this is very promising to me. And we just have to see whether this leads to the concrete strategy so that EU can and will fill the gap if Trump really pulls out its support to Ukraine, and Trump may even pull out the US from the NATO. So, I mean, there is a lot of uncertainty here, but the EU should really be ready for any certainty that's yet to come.
I want to talk a little bit about the UK's role, because Keir Starmer has stepped up, and there is, as of today, when we're recording this, a peace summit on Ukraine happening in London with the European powers there. What role does the UK perhaps have in the EU's defending itself? And perhaps a secondary question is a lot about the collaboration around having every 27 member state being more secure, something on defence spending as well, because the UK has recently stepped up and said it will be put 2.5% GDP into its defence spending as well. So just maybe we can have a look at that.
Sure. I mean, UK, I think, is already playing quite an important role for its own security, because this is European continent, but also, steering the processes, which is very good, because UK currently is not the EU member state. So here is the role of the UK to be, very much engaged in common European concerns, which is, I think, very good. And also UK has been having very strong policy, a foreign policy, which is not shifted, it's not changed under any prime ministers we've seen over the past decades, because we had quite a lot of flow of the prime minister, but something that really stayed in place, that was UK's foreign policy. So this, we see that it continues quite strongly. We also saw Starmer's quite active, engaging support towards Volodymyr Zelensky, the way he greeted him up to the point of organizing this summit quite last minute. So this is all very, very promising, and it's very good to see that UK is willing and able to play the leading role here to bring all these parties around the table, and the parties are there too. So this is very promising, and also UK has been the one that also promised that it may be ready to send the troops on the Europe as the peacekeepers, or whatever they will decide to call them. So this is all very, very promising. On the defense spending and what can the EU do, I mean, EU definitely should cooperate with the UK, because the UK has something EU doesn't have, right? This hard power, and EU is there. European leaders are there, EU leaders are there. This is very good. But the defense spending across the Union is very much split. There is the East Bloc, which really stepped up in terms of the defense spending, and then there is West and the North, which, you cannot say they all split it up, not at all. And there is a major concern also what the voters and the citizens want, whether they want, their leaders to speed up and increase the spending. That's another issue. So there is a little bit of divide across the Union when it comes to the defense spending. But here again, EU has already voiced what should be the position of the Union, and made its, spending, announced that it would make the spending rules more flexible so they can go beyond the deficit rules, which is also something EU needs to do, right? I mean, this is revisit the rules and make it more flexible to fit to the defense sector, but also we have to see how this will be shaped up. But the messages and the trajectory is very on the right track. We just have to see how fast the Union and the wider European countries will go on this track.
Well, given all of that context, how can the EU guarantee security for Ukraine?
Well, the only way that the EU can guarantee the security to Ukraine is to be able itself to defend itself, right? And this will a bit take time, and my concern is that we don't have that much time when it comes to Ukraine, right? Time is running up now, and also this is the treaty that also stipulates this common solidarity clause. Something similar to NATO, except, European Union doesn't have the same defense capabilities as the NATO. And of course, this is one thing that EU, stepping up its own defense spending, make it possible for itself to defend itself and the candidate countries. But another thing is to, really promote and make it happen that Ukraine becomes part of the NATO. Because if Ukraine had become the part of the NATO, then we are fine. There are security there, so there is no need of security guarantees, and there are not immediate needs for the security guarantees. This will be need in the medium to long term. But right now, we can then have the security guarantees of Ukraine. But of course, it's very, very difficult because parts of the country are still under Russian occupation, and then we're not sure whether there is a political will in NATO to accept, at least parts or entire Ukraine, I don't know how the war ends, into the alliance. So there are a lot of, moving stones here, so we don't have the puzzle complete. But there are the two things that we certainly know. One thing, to make Ukraine part of NATO, so that we can have all its secured right now. And another one, that Union steps up its capability to defend itself and being actually ready to defend itself in the candidate countries. But again, this will take time.
Well, talking of NATO, everyone's been discussing whether Trump will pull the US out of NATO. If that happens, how will that change the security architecture of Europe?
Well, that will really change a lot, because US being in the NATO, that was something that would make NATO credible, right?
Yes.
But on the other hand, as the Trump really shifts his mind and shifts the US foreign policy, or at least we have the trajectory there, it also becomes it becomes under the question the credibility of the alliance itself, because if the Article 5 is not triggered, by the way, it has never been triggered, so we don't know how that would actually work in practice. If the Trump is not ready to trigger it, then, NATO loses credibility anyways. Obviously, pulling US out, that would really, really, question the credibility of the alliance, but we see the credibility still under the question mark right now. And that would definitely affect the overall credibility of the alliance. This is why it's extremely important that the EU and the wider European and non-European players like Canada are around the table, so they're kind of getting ready for whatever we may witness in the near future.
Well, it's a rapidly evolving landscape, and there's a lot to be discussed around this. Thank you very much for giving not only me but our listeners some brilliant context to this, and we'll speak soon. Take care. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Bye-bye.